In our previous story, we followed Sheriff Jonas Harwell, a battle-scarred Civil War veteran who had sworn off love and resigned himself to a life of solitude in the frontier town of Bitter Creek, Texas, 1847. When notorious outlaw Black Pete Donovan was captured, Judge Cornelius Whitmore shocked everyone with an unprecedented verdict. Instead of hanging, Jonas would be forced to marry Pete's daughter, Mary Catherine, as an alternative form of justice. What began as a reluctant arrangement between two strangers, a broken sheriff convinced he was cursed to die alone, and a young woman burdened by her father's criminal legacy, slowly transformed into something neither expected. Despite the town's skepticism and their own fears, Jonas and Mary Catherine discovered that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can heal the deepest wounds. Our story ended with them finding hope together, two people who had been destined for loneliness now facing the future as one. But their story was far from over, and many questions remained unanswered. 3 months had passed since Judge Whitmore's unusual verdict, and the morning sun cast long shadows across Bitter Creek's main street as Jonas Harwell made his daily rounds. The wedding ring on his finger still felt foreign, a constant reminder of how drastically his life had changed. Yet as he walked past the general store, he caught sight of his wife through the window, and something in his chest tightened, not with the old familiar pain of loss, but with something he was still learning to recognize as hope. Mary Catherine Donovan Harwell had proven to be nothing like what anyone in town had expected. The daughter of the notorious Black Pete had seamlessly integrated herself into the fabric of Bitter Creek society, volunteering at the church, helping at the schoolhouse, and slowly but surely winning over even the most skeptical residents. But Jonas knew the weight she carried, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way some people still looked at her with suspicion. The jail had been unusually quiet lately. Black Pete himself sat in the back cell, awaiting transport to the territorial prison in Austin. The outlaw had been sentenced to 15 years hard labor, a verdict that had surprised many who expected a hanging. But Judge Whitmore had been clear in his reasoning. The man's cooperation in revealing the locations of stolen goods and the names of his associates had earned him a chance at redemption, however slim. Jonas pushed open the jailhouse door and found Pete sitting on his cot, whittling a small piece of wood. The resemblance between father and daughter was undeniable. The same sharp cheekbones, the same intelligent green eyes that seemed to see everything. But where Mary Catherine's gaze held warmth and determination, Pete's carried the weight of a lifetime of poor choices. "Sheriff," Pete nodded without looking up from his carving. "Come to tell me the wagon's here?" Jonas hung his hat on the peg by the door. "Transport's not coming until next week. Judge wants to make sure all the stolen property is recovered first." Pete's hands stilled. "You treating her right?" The question hung in the air between them. Jonas had been expecting it for weeks, this inevitable conversation between a father and the man who had married his daughter under the most unusual circumstances. "I'm trying to," Jonas said honestly. She's stronger than either of us gave her credit for." A bitter laugh escaped Pete's lips. "Stronger than me, that's for damn sure. Girl's got her mother's backbone." His voice softened. "Sarah would have liked you, Sheriff. You're the kind of man she always wanted for our Mary Catherine." Jonas pulled up a chair, something he'd never done in all his years as a lawman. "Tell me about her mother." For the next hour, Pete Donovan transformed from notorious outlaw to grieving widower and regretful father. He spoke of Sarah's kindness, her unwavering faith, and how she'd tried desperately to keep their family together even as Pete's choices pulled them apart. He told Jonas about Mary Catherine as a child, bright, curious, always trying to see the good in everyone, even her outlaw father. "I know what people think," Pete said, his voice growing heavy, "that I corrupted her, that she's bound to turn out like me. But you listen here, Sheriff. That girl's got more goodness in her little finger than I've had in my whole miserable life. Judge Whitmore saw it too. That's why he did what he did." Jonas frowned. "What do you mean?" Pete set down his whittling and looked directly at Jonas for the first time. "You think that verdict was random? That cranky old judge just decided to play matchmaker on a whim?" He shook his head. "Cornelius Whitmore's been watching this town for 20 years. He knew you were drowning in your own guilt and grief. He knew my daughter needed a chance at a respectable life, and he knew that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places." The revelation hit Jonas like a physical blow. "He planned this?" "Planned might be too strong a word," Pete continued. "But when I was captured, when he saw Mary Catherine in that courtroom defending her worthless father with such dignity and courage, well, let's just say the judge is a lot more perceptive than most folks give him credit for. He saw two people who needed each other, even if they didn't know it themselves. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Jonas stood and looked out the window to see a group of riders approaching, rough-looking men with hard faces and worn leather. His hand instinctively moved to his gun. "Friends of yours?" Jonas asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Pete's face went pale as he recognized the lead rider. "That's Jake Morrison," he whispered. "My former partner. And if he's here, it means trouble for everyone in this town, especially my daughter. If you're enjoying this dramatic continuation, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from." Now let's see what happens next in Bitter Creek. Jonas stepped out of the jailhouse, his hand resting on his gun, as Jake Morrison and his men rode into town. The lead rider was exactly as Pete had described. Tall, lean, with cold eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness, every opportunity. Behind him rode 4 other men, all armed, all looking like they'd rather shoot than talk. Mary Catherine emerged from the general store at that moment, her arms full of supplies for the evening meal. Jonas felt his blood run cold as Morrison's gaze fixed on her, a predatory smile spreading across his weathered face. "Well, well," Morrison called out, dismounting slowly. "If it isn't little Mary Catherine Donovan, though I hear it's Harwell now." He spat in the dust. "Heard you went and married yourself a lawman. Your daddy must be real proud." Mary Catherine straightened her shoulders, and Jonas recognized the same courage he'd seen in the courtroom 3 months ago. "Mr. Morrison," she said evenly, "I wasn't expecting to see you in Bitter Creek." "I'll bet you weren't," Morrison replied, his men spreading out behind him in a practiced formation. "See, your daddy and I had some unfinished business. Some money that went missing right before he got himself caught. Money that belongs to me and the boys here." Jonas stepped forward, positioning himself between Morrison and his wife. "The only business Black Pete has now is with the territorial court system. He's already confessed to his crimes and made restitution where possible." Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Restitution? Sheriff, you don't understand. Pete didn't just steal from banks and stagecoaches. He stole from us, his own partners, took our share of the Gillespie County job and hid it somewhere before you caught him." Inside the jail, Pete had heard enough. He called out through the barred window, "Jake Morrison, you lying snake. I told you the truth about that money. It was lost when the posse caught up with us at Devil's Canyon." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Then I guess we'll just have to persuade you to remember better, won't we, Pete?" His gaze shifted back to Mary Catherine. "Funny thing about family, Sheriff. Sometimes they know things they don't even realize they know." The threat was clear, and Jonas felt the familiar rage that had once consumed him on Civil War battlefields beginning to build. But this time, it wasn't the destructive fury of his past. It was the protective instinct of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "You need to leave town," Jonas said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of years of keeping the peace. "Now, or what?" Morrison challenged. "You'll arrest all 5 of us? You're just one man, Sheriff." Before Jonas could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the general store. Dr. Samuel Hayes emerged, followed by Reverend Thomas Miller and 3 other townsmen, all armed. Word had spread quickly through Bitter Creek, and the community that had once been skeptical of Mary Catherine was now rallying to protect her. "Actually," said Dr. Hayes, leveling his rifle at Morrison, "he's not alone." Judge Whitmore's voice boomed from across the street. "Mr. Morrison!" The elderly judge approached with his walking stick, moving with surprising authority despite his age. "I suggest you reconsider your course of action. This town is under my jurisdiction, and threatening citizens, especially the wife of our sheriff, is a serious offense." Morrison's confidence wavered slightly as he realized the odds had shifted. "This ain't over, Judge. Pete owes us, and one way or another we're gonna collect." "Perhaps," Judge Whitmore said calmly, "but not today and not in my town. You have until sunset to be beyond the county line, or I'll have you arrested for conspiracy and threatening a peace officer." As Morrison and his men reluctantly mounted their horses, the outlaw leader looked directly at Mary Catherine. "You might have fooled these townsfolk, girl, but I know what you really are. You're Pete Donovan's daughter, and that blood don't wash clean no matter who you marry." After the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, Jonas found himself standing next to his wife, both of them surrounded by neighbors who had come to their defense. Mary Catherine's hands were trembling slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Thank you," she said to the gathered crowd. "All of you. I know my father's past makes some of you uncomfortable, but—" "Nonsense," interrupted Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the baker's wife who had been one of Mary Catherine's harshest critics. "You're one of us now, dear. and we protect our own. Later that evening, as Jonas and Mary Catherine sat on their front porch, she finally voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart. What if Morrison's right? What if I can never truly escape my father's shadow? Jonas took her hand, noting how it fit perfectly in his. Then we'll face that shadow together. That's what marriage means. Not just the good times, but standing together when the darkness comes. As darkness settled over Bitter Creek, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison's departure had been too easy. The outlaw had built his reputation on never backing down from a fight, and the way he'd looked at Mary Catherine suggested this confrontation was far from over. Jonas checked the locks on their small house for the third time, his war-trained instincts screaming that danger still lurked in the shadows. Mary Catherine watched her husband's restless pacing from their kitchen table, where she was mending one of his shirts. "Jonas," she said softly, "you're wearing a hole in the floorboards." He stopped mid-stride, realizing she was right. "I'm sorry. It's just, men like Morrison don't give up that easily." "Tell me about the war," she said suddenly, setting down her sewing. "You've never spoken of it, but I see it in your eyes sometimes. The same look you had today when Morrison threatened us." Jonas sat heavily in the chair across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. For 3 months he'd managed to avoid this conversation, but Mary Catherine's direct gaze made it impossible to deflect. "I was at Antietam," he began slowly. 17,000 casualties in a single day. I watched boys, children really, die in ways that—" He paused, struggling with words that had remained locked inside him for 5 years. "I thought I'd used up all my capacity to care about anyone. Every person I tried to protect, every friend I made, they all ended up dead." Mary Catherine reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "But you didn't die." "Sometimes I wished I had," Jonas admitted. "The guilt of surviving when so many good men didn't. It felt easier to stay alone, to not risk caring about anyone again. And now?" Jonas looked into her green eyes, so much like her father's, yet filled with a warmth Pete had never possessed. "Now I'm terrified," he said honestly. "Because I do care. About you, about this town, about the life we're building together. And that makes Morrison's threat real in a way nothing has been for years." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the front door. Jonas immediately went for his gun, motioning for Mary Catherine to stay back. Through the window he could see Dr. Hayes on their porch, his medical bag in hand. "Sheriff," Hayes called out, "there's been an incident at the jail. You need to come quickly." Jonas and Mary Catherine hurried through the dark streets to find a crowd gathered outside the jailhouse. Deputy Miller, Jonas's part-time assistant, was nursing a bloodied head wound while Judge Whitmore examined the jail's back wall, where someone had clearly attempted to break through the adobe bricks. "What happened?" Jonas demanded. "Morrison came back," Deputy Miller explained, wincing as Dr. Hayes cleaned his wound. "About an hour after sunset. Had 2 men with him. Tried to bust Pete out through the back wall. When I confronted them, one of them clubbed me with a rifle butt." Jonas examined the damage. The wall showed clear signs of pickaxe work, but the thick adobe had held. "Where are they now?" "Gone," Judge Whitmore said grimly. "But they left this." He handed Jonas a piece of paper with crude handwriting. "The money or the girl. You have until noon tomorrow. Devil's Canyon." Inside the jail, Pete Donovan sat on his cot, his face pale with worry. "Sheriff, you can't let them take her. I'll tell you the truth about that money. All of it. But you have to promise me Mary Catherine stays safe." Jonas pulled up a chair, his patience finally exhausted. "Then start talking, Pete. All of it. No more half-truths or convenient omissions." Pete took a deep breath. "There was no Gillespie County job. Not the way Jake thinks. We did hit a bank there, but the money we took was counterfeit. Fake bills printed by a crooked banker who was trying to cover his own embezzlement. By the time we figured it out, we'd already spent most of it, and what was left wasn't worth the paper it was printed on." "Then why does Morrison think you're hiding real money?" "Because I let him think that," Pete admitted. "When we split up after the job went bad, I told him I was keeping the money safe until things cooled down. I was buying time, hoping to figure out how to tell him the truth without getting myself killed." Judge Whitmore stroked his beard thoughtfully. "So Morrison and his men have been planning this confrontation for months, believing they're owed thousands of dollars that never actually existed." "That's about the size of it," Pete nodded. "And now they're willing to hurt my daughter to get money that was never real in the first place." Mary Catherine, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Then we tell them the truth. They won't believe it," Pete said. "Jake Morrison's not the type to accept that he's been chasing a ghost for 6 months. He'll think we're lying to protect the money." Jonas stood up, his mind already working through the tactical situation. Then we'll have to prove it to him. But first we need to make sure you're safe, Mary Catherine. Morrison's desperate and desperate men do unpredictable things. I'm not hiding, she said firmly. This is my family's mess, and I won't let others clean it up for me. Dawn broke over Bitter Creek with an ominous red sky, and Jonas had barely slept. He'd spent the night alternating between checking the perimeter of their house and watching Mary Catherine sleep, memorizing the peaceful expression on her face in case it was the last time he'd see it. By sunrise, word of Morrison's ultimatum had spread throughout the town, and Jonas wasn't surprised to find Judge Whitmore, Dr. Hayes, and several other men gathered in his kitchen when he emerged from the bedroom. We've been talking, Judge Whitmore announced without preamble, and we have a plan. Jonas poured himself coffee from the pot Mary Catherine had prepared, noting how her hands remained steady despite the circumstances. I'm listening. Morrison wants proof about the counterfeit money, Dr. Hayes explained. It happens that I served as the territorial medical examiner in Gillespie County 2 years ago. I was present when they investigated that bank robbery and discovered the forgery scheme. I have documentation. Judge Whitmore spread several official-looking papers across the table. Bank records, territorial investigator reports, even samples of the counterfeit bills. Everything needed to prove Pete's story. That's assuming Morrison will listen to reason, Jonas said skeptically. That's where the rest of us come in, said Tom Patterson, the baker, as he entered with 3 other townsmen. Morrison and his boys are expecting you to come alone to Devil's Canyon. They're not expecting a territorial posse with legal authority to arrest them for kidnapping and extortion. Mary Catherine looked up from the papers she'd been examining. These documents prove my father was telling the truth about the worthless money, but they also show something else. She pointed to a specific line in the investigator's report. The counterfeit operation was run by Ezra Blackwood, the bank president. According to this, he fled to Mexico with the real money from the bank's vault. Jonas leaned over her shoulder, reading the document. So Morrison and his men weren't just cheated out of stolen money. They were cheated by the very person they were stealing from. Exactly, Judge Whitmore said. Morrison's been barking up the wrong tree entirely. Pete and his gang were victims of the same fraud that eventually brought down the entire bank. As the morning progressed, more details of the plan emerged. Judge Whitmore would use his territorial authority to deputize several townsmen, creating a legitimate posse. Dr. Hayes would present the medical and legal evidence to Morrison, and Jonas would face the outlaw leader as both sheriff and husband, backed by the full force of the law. But Mary Catherine had other ideas. I'm coming with you, she announced as Jonas checked his guns for the 3rd time. Absolutely not, Jonas replied immediately. Mary Catherine, this isn't negotiable. Morrison's made it clear you're his target. And that's exactly why I need to be there, she countered. He's not going to believe any of this evidence unless he hears it directly from a Donovan. My father's reputation is built on lies and half-truths, but maybe, just maybe, if Morrison sees that I'm willing to face him directly, he'll understand that we're finally telling the truth. Judge Whitmore studied her with the same intensity he'd shown during her father's trial. The girl has a point, Jonas. Morrison's demand was specific, the money or the girl. If she's not there, he might assume we're trying to trick him. Jonas felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the same burden he'd carried for every soldier under his command during the war. But this time, the person he was trying to protect wasn't just another casualty waiting to happen. She was his wife, his partner, his reason for believing that survival could mean more than just existing. If you come, Jonas said finally, you follow my orders without question. This isn't about pride or proving a point, it's about all of us getting home alive. Mary Catherine nodded solemnly. I understand. An hour before noon, the makeshift posse rode out toward Devil's Canyon, a narrow ravine 3 miles east of town where outlaws had been meeting for decades. Jonas rode point, with Mary Catherine beside him and Judge Whitmore's official party following at a careful distance. As they approached the canyon's mouth, Jonas could see Morrison and his 4 men positioned strategically among the rocks, their horses tethered behind them. The outlaw leader stood in the center of the canyon floor, his arms crossed, waiting. Remember, Jonas said quietly to Mary Catherine, no matter what he says, no matter how he tries to provoke you, stay calm. Angry people make mistakes and we can't afford any mistakes today. She reached over and briefly touched his hand. 3 months ago, I thought my life was over when the judge announced his sentence. Now I realize it was just beginning. Whatever happens in that canyon, Jonas, I want you to know that these have been the happiest months of my life. Before Jonas could respond, Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Time's up, Sheriff. Did you bring my money or do I take the girl?" Jonas spurred his horse forward, Mary Catherine riding steadily beside him, as they descended into Devil's Canyon to face whatever truth Morrison was willing to accept. The canyon wall seemed to close in around them as Jonas and Mary Catherine rode into Devil's Canyon, the echo of their horses' hooves creating an ominous rhythm. Morrison stood waiting in the center of the sandy floor, his 4 men positioned strategically on the rocky ledges above, rifles trained on the approaching riders. "Well, well," Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily in the confined space. "Look what we have here. The sheriff brought his pretty little wife after all. Question is, did he bring my money?" Jonas dismounted slowly, his hand never straying far from his gun. "We brought something better than money, Morrison. We brought the truth." Morrison's harsh laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "The truth? Sheriff, I've been chasing the truth for 6 months. The truth is that Pete Donovan stole $20,000 from me and my boys, and now I'm here to collect." Mary Catherine dismounted and stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance despite the rifles pointed at them. "Mr. Morrison, what if I told you that the money you're looking for never existed? I'd say you're lying to protect your daddy, same as always. Then perhaps you'll believe official territorial documents." Judge Whitmore's voice boomed as he rode into view with Dr. Hayes and the deputized townsman. Morrison's men shifted nervously on their perches, suddenly outnumbered. Dr. Hayes dismounted and approached Morrison with a leather satchel. "Mr. Morrison, I was the territorial medical examiner in Gillespie County when your gang robbed the merchant's bank. I was also present when we discovered that the money you stole was counterfeit." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. We counted that money ourselves." "You counted worthless paper," Dr. Hayes replied, opening his satchel and removing several official documents. "The bank president, Ezra Blackwood, had been printing counterfeit bills to cover his own embezzlement. When you and Pete's gang robbed the bank, you took fake money while Blackwood escaped to Mexico with the real funds." Judge Whitmore held up a sample bill. "This is what genuine currency looks like, Morrison. Compare it to what you actually stole." For the first time since Jonas had known him, Morrison looked uncertain. He examined the documents Dr. Hayes offered, his weathered face growing pale as he read the official territorial investigation report. This can't be right," Morrison muttered. "We split up that money. Pete took his share." "Of worthless paper," Mary Catherine said firmly. "My father didn't cheat you, Mr. Morrison. You were all cheated by the same man, Ezra Blackwood, who's probably living comfortably in Mexico on the real money while you've spent 6 months planning revenge for a crime that never happened." Jonas watched Morrison's face carefully, recognizing the look of a man whose entire worldview was crumbling. It was the same expression he'd seen on soldiers' faces when they realized that the cause they'd been fighting for was built on lies. "Even if this is true," Morrison said slowly, "it doesn't change the fact that I've wasted months of my life, put my men at risk, and have nothing to show for it." "It changes everything," Jonas replied. "It means you can walk away from this canyon without blood on your hands. It means you can stop being Jake Morrison the outlaw and start being just Jake Morrison the man." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, the only sound in the canyon the whisper of wind through the rocks. His men waited above, weapons still ready, but Jonas could sense the uncertainty spreading through their ranks as well. "What about Pete?" Morrison finally asked. "He still lied to me. Let me think he was holding out on us." Mary Catherine stepped forward. "My father made a mistake trying to protect himself instead of telling you the truth immediately. But he's already paying for that mistake and for all his other crimes. The territorial court will transport him to prison next week where he'll serve his sentence." "And what happens to us?" one of Morrison's men called down from the rocks. Judge Whitmore spoke with the full authority of his office. "That depends on what you do in the next few minutes. Leave peacefully and this incident ends here. Continue with this course of action, and I'll have you all arrested for kidnapping, extortion, and threatening a peace officer." Morrison looked around the canyon, at his men, at the official posse, at the documents that proved his quest for revenge had been built on a foundation of lies. Jonas saw the moment when the fight went out of him, when the anger that had driven him for months finally collapsed under the weight of reality. "Stand down, boys," Morrison called to his men. "We're done here." As Morrison's gang slowly emerged from their positions, weapons lowered, Jonas felt Mary Catherine's hand slip into his. The simple gesture, public, unashamed, defiant of anyone who might question their unconventional marriage, told him more about her courage than any words could have. "This doesn't make us friends, Sheriff," Morrison said as he prepared to mount his horse. "I never expected it would," Jonas replied, "but it makes us something better. It makes us men who chose truth over violence. As Morrison and his men rode out of Devil's Canyon, Jonas realized that for the first time since the war, he had protected someone he cared about, without losing them in the process. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Devil's Canyon, Bitter Creek had settled into a rhythm of normalcy that Jonas found both comforting and strange. The town's acceptance of his marriage to Mary Catherine had been swift and complete, partly due to his handling of the Morrison situation, but mostly because the people had witnessed firsthand how the couple supported each other through crisis. Jonas stood outside the territorial courthouse watching as Pete Donovan was loaded into the prison transport wagon. Despite everything, Mary Catherine had insisted on saying goodbye to her father. "I know I haven't been much of a father to you," Pete said through the wagon's barred window, his voice heavy with regret. "But seeing how you've grown, seeing the woman you've become, maybe I did one thing right in my life." Mary Catherine reached through the bars and briefly touched his hand. "You taught me to be strong, Papa, even when you didn't mean to." As the wagon rolled away toward the territorial prison, Jonas put his arm around his wife's shoulders. She didn't cry. Mary Catherine rarely cried, but he could feel the tension in her body, the weight of finally closing this chapter of her life. "Any regrets?" Jonas asked quietly. "Only that it took a crisis for him to finally be honest with me," she replied. "What about you? Any regrets about marrying a convicted thief's daughter?" Jonas turned to face her fully, his hands cupping her face gently. "Mary Catherine Whitman, you are the finest woman I've ever known. Your father's crimes don't define you any more than my war experiences define me, Doctor." Hayes approached them as they prepared to leave the courthouse. "Sheriff, I have news about Morrison and his men. They were spotted in Tucson, apparently working legitimate jobs for the railroad. Seems like your talk about choosing truth over violence made an impression." Jonas nodded, feeling a satisfaction he hadn't expected. Sometimes people just need someone to show them there's another way. Over the following months, Jonas discovered that civilian life suited him better than he'd imagined. The skills that had served him in war, strategic thinking, calm under pressure, the ability to read people, translated well to peacekeeping. But more importantly, he found that having something to protect besides his own survival gave his life a purpose he'd been missing. Mary Catherine threw herself into building their life together, with the same determination she'd shown in facing Morrison. She started a small dressmaking business, her skilled hands creating beautiful garments for the women of Bitter Creek. Her reputation for fairness and quality grew quickly, and within 6 months she was receiving orders from neighboring towns. "I never thought I'd be grateful for those years of mending clothes for saloon girls," she admitted one evening, as she worked on an elaborate wedding dress by lamplight. "But those skills are feeding us now." Jonas looked up from the sheriff's reports he was reviewing. "Speaking of feeding us, Judge Whitmore offered me a permanent position as territorial sheriff. It would mean more responsibility, but also a real salary instead of just the town's modest fees." Mary Catherine set down her sewing. "What do you want to do?" "I want to build a life here," Jonas said honestly. "With you, in this community that's given us both a second chance. But only if that's what you want too." She moved to sit beside him on their small sofa, her hand finding his. "Jonas, 6 months ago I thought my life was over. I was angry, bitter, convinced that everyone would always see me as Pete Donovan's criminal daughter. Then I married a man I barely knew and somehow discovered that I could be more than my father's mistakes." "We both discovered that," Jonas replied. "I spent 5 years believing that caring about people was just setting myself up for more loss. You taught me that the risk of losing someone is worth taking when the alternative is never truly living at all." As winter settled over Bitter Creek, Jonas and Mary Catherine established traditions that would define their marriage for decades to come. Sunday dinners with Judge Whitmore and his wife. Evening walks through town where Jonas could check on citizens and Mary Catherine could visit with customers. Quiet nights by their fireplace, where they shared stories of their pasts without shame or judgment. The nightmares that had plagued Jonas since the war began to fade, replaced by dreams of the future he and Mary Catherine were building together. And Mary Catherine, who had spent years defined by other people's actions and expectations, discovered her own voice and used it to become one of Bitter Creek's most respected citizens. On their first wedding anniversary, they stood together in the same church where Judge Whitmore had pronounced their sentence. But this time, they renewed their vows by choice, surrounded by friends who had become family. "I, Jonas, take you, Mary Catherine, to be my wife," he said, his voice strong and clear, "not by court order, but by the choice of my heart." "I, Mary Catherine, take you, Jonas, to be my husband," she replied, tears of joy finally falling freely. for better or worse, by choice, and by love. As they kissed to seal their renewed commitment, Jonas realized that sometimes the best chapters of life begin with the words "by order of the court." Their unconventional beginning had led to a love neither had expected, but both had earned through courage, honesty, and the willingness to see past each other's worst moments to their best possibilities. The end,